Okay, so let's start with the evolution of South Africa. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company set up a refreshment station. And again, go back to South Africa, they set up this refreshment station right here. And it was supposed to refresh all the sailors who were going around trying to get to India to get all the good stuff. Okay, and we've seen this before, right? In India, the British East India Company, which came to rule large swaths of India, exercising military power, assuming administrative functions, to the exclusion gradually of its commercial pursuits even. So, in this case also, they come for commercial interest. The Dutch East India Company comes to set up this refreshment station, to feed the sailors, to give them fresh water, all that kind of stuff. But then they decide that the land is theirs for the taking. And it's a very gradual process. Imagine, you're sent down to the southern tip of Africa to resupply ships. Well, how are you going to do that? You need some sort of agriculture to do this. And so these Afrikaner farmers, who become known as Boers, B-O-E-R-S, right here, they take over land. Right? They settle the land so that they can produce these farms so that they can resupply. The Afrikaners, of course, in the mythology of South Africa, said that this was empty, and it wasn't really. There's evidence of people long ago, including the Khoisans, this group of people who they actually enslaved, but also more recent movements. So by the time the British come in 1795, the Boers are well entrenched in South Africa. They've got their own culture. I mentioned this Pidgin Dutch language. And this is another crucial point. When you talk to Afrikaners about how they developed and why they developed the way they did, well, the Afrikaners missed the liberalization of European thought, the Enlightenment, because they were geographically distant. We've talked about this in other contexts. What other peoples that we've discussed claim to have been blocked from this? That's a pause. Think. Right, the Russians. Same thing. Under the Tatar yoke, under the Mughals, the Mongols. So the same sort of thing. So again, another really interesting concept to think about. We missed this evolution, therefore we evolved differently. Or this step in the evolution that everyone else went through. In the early 1800s, the Dutch East India Company went bankrupt. And so they handed control over to the Brits. Now the Boers didn't like this. The Boers weren't connected to the Brits. They were very suspect. And so around 12,000 Boers begin this great trek into the interior in 1835. And that's the picture that you see here. This is a picture of the Great Trek. They had guns. They were fighting off various other groups. The Xhosas. In 1838, they had the Battle of Blood River, where a quote-unquote miracle occurred, where these outnumbered whites defeated the Zulus. Again, thanks to the guns. But what happens is eventually the Boers make it into the center of the country, and they are largely autonomous in the center. They allow for slavery, strict segregation, and the Brits let them do this. The Brits let them rule their own swath of land until in the late 1800s, the Brits find out that there are diamonds and gold there. And this eventually leads to the Boer War from 1899 to 1902. Because the Brits want control over the land that the Boers have settled over the last several decades. This is brutal. We've got concentration camps that were actually set up for Afrikaners. But it raises moral quandaries. It's sort of like the firebombing of Dresden. You were on the wrong side, but innocents were also killed. Civilians were killed in a horrible way. And so these concentration camps have largely been overlooked by history because of the awful way the Afrikaners ran the country. They're part of the country then, and then the entire country afterwards. So, stepping away from that moral quandary, there is finally a peace treaty that the Brits signed, which gives the Boers political rights, as well as the right to deny non-whites political rights in the two former Boer lands, these republics that they control. So, as we move on, let's keep in mind that colonists were racist, period. Around the world, colonists were racist. The Europeans came and they wanted to civilize, right? The great civilizing mission, the political, cultural reason for explanation in part for some of these empires or colonies, I should say. But they were racist everywhere. And the institutionalization of segregation really went on within this British colony. In 1913, you had the Native Land Act, which said that blacks cannot own land. And this was going on despite, after 1917, this focus on minorities within Europe. But they were white minorities, right? They were different, said the Europeans. So you had enormous discrimination, even in British-controlled South Africa. In 1914, the Afrikaners create the National Party because not only is there discrimination against blacks, according to the Afrikaners, but they are also marginalized economically. And so certainly they're doing better than as whites than non-whites. But they begin to preach white supremacy and also the removal of South Africa from the British Empire and the redistribution of the economy essentially to Afrikaners. And they gain autonomy, but within the British Empire. So South Africa gains autonomy within the British Empire in 1910. Then they get more autonomy in the form of statehood in 1934. And finally in 1961, they are completely sovereign. But really, as of 1934, we can talk about sovereignty because of statehood. The National Party takes power after World War II in 1948, and this is formally the start of the apartheid era. And they sought to consolidate their power by doing the things that were in line with their ideology and also would empower them. And so, for example, the 1950 Population Registration Act. This is what created the racial categories that we talked about, and they borrowed heavily from the Germans. They would measure people's foreheads, their noses, their, I don't know, what other body parts you measure. I shouldn't have even said that. They measured these various things to determine what race these people were. So, for example, I had a Zulu instructor when I studied in 1994 in South Africa. I had a Zulu instructor who grew up with a Zulu family until around 11, 12 years old. And then the South African authorities said, wait a second, and they did some measurements, I think of his forehead or something, and they said, you're not Zulu, you're colored. And they literally took him away from his family. They put him in with a colored foster family, and he started going to colored schools. And so imagine this, it's essentially kidnapping. So the Population Registration Act, the 1950 Group Areas Act, where they established these Bantustans. So now we can talk about the functions. As I mentioned before, these are sort of these reservations. They're the poorest. They're controlled. They allowed for various ethnic groups to control them. So there were a handful of them. They divided up these ethnic groups and said, this one's yours, this one's yours, this one's yours. They're often non-contiguous lands. What was key about this? Two things that were key. First of all, they made all of these Africans guests in their own country. They were guests in South Africa because they lived on the Bantustans, and so they had to have passes to go into South Africa. And also, second, by separating Africans into these various quote-unquote nations, they could show that the whites were the largest numerically in the population. Right? It's no longer 75% versus 13%. Africans versus whites. It's cut them up into, I don't remember exactly how many there were, but let's say 75 divided by 9. Well, so now it's 13% versus, let's say, 8% or so. Whatever it turns out to be. And so there were a couple reasons for this Group Areas Act. And so that's another one of the major reforms they put down. The Prohibition of Marriages Act says you can't marry across races. And finally, you've got the 1953 Reservation of Separate Amenities Act, which is the sort of thing that we saw in the United States around that time, separating beaches, bathrooms, water fountains, and all that by race. So the great oddity you have in South Africa is that you've got this procedural democracy for a minority. You've got regular fair elections. You've got an independent court. For some of the time, you've got a relatively free media. You've got Afrikaners doing very well politically and economically. And then you've got the rest. Okay, the majority. The majority doesn't have access to the elections, to the independent courts, very unfair, politicized trials, etc., etc., etc. And the picture that you see here is from the 1950 Group Areas Act, which forced these people here living in the outskirts of Durban, this area called Cato Manor, into further outlying townships, which again involves much higher costs of getting to work. You're talking about 2-hour commute time. It's awful. So all this obviously leads to an opposition. The opposition was led by the African National Congress. The African National Congress was initially founded in 1912, and they demanded suffrage for all blacks. And blacks is actually usually a term in South Africa that refers to Africans, coloreds, and Indians. So sorry if I misstated that earlier. So they wanted suffrage for all blacks. They allied themselves with the South African Communist Party. True to ideology, those guys actually trained up in Russia. They received military training. Now, On the more radical side of the opposition, you had the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, which developed along with the Black Consciousness Movement, which sort of began around 1959. All of these organizations, though, were banned by 1960, the year of the Sharpeville Massacre. So the Sharpeville Massacre occurs, remember, the state harasses and controls the population by demanding passes. You can't go anywhere without your pass. So there's no freedom of movement for the population, as per, ding, 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 the Population Registration Act and the Group Areas Act. With this, in March 1960, around 6,000 people went out to protest it. So the way they protested it is they went en masse to the police station in Sharpeville, and they said, hey, I don't have my pass. Arrest me. 6,000 people, this small police station. It was a peaceful protest. But the police opened fire, and according to a lieutenant at the station, quote, the native mentality does not allow them to gather for a peaceful demonstration. For them, to gather means violence. And so they killed 69 people. 180 plus were injured. And this prompted the ANC to establish a military wing in exile. Finally, they took up arms. They realized they could no longer solely rely on peaceful means. And they created what's known as Umkhonto we Sizwe. It means Spear of the Nation, MK for short. This is their military wing. So the role of civil society in the struggle was enormous. Remember, the ANC is banned. All the opposition groups are banned. So the ANC, if you're an ANC leader, you're either sitting in jail, or you're deep in underground, or you're in exile. And much of the leadership went into exile. So civil society becomes key to taking over a lot of the role of the ANC. And there were lots of connections between the ANC in exile and these community-based organizations, whether the civics or the unions. So this includes everything from churches, parent groups, student and youth organizations. All these things were taking place on the ground. And eventually the ANC becomes represented in the country by two key groups of political activists, the civics and the unions. The civics are local grassroots neighborhood units. They're organized around popular grievances, things like rent control, or demands for rent control. So remember, everything's owned by the whites, and so they can increase the rents. They wanted to put a stop to this. Other day-to-day concerns that seem trivial, like clotheslines, less trivial, like poor sanitation, access to electricity. These were the things that people mobilized around. So the first civics started in the late 1970s, but you had daily media coverage of civic-backed events, including protests and later work stayaways and consumer boycotts, and information spreads quickly, and it leads to the rise of new civic associations around the country. So the rise of all these neighborhood associations that weren't formally allied, but worked closely together. And then the second point were the unions. Again, these were oriented towards standard workers' issues first. Okay, but they quickly realized that they needed much larger political changes for shop floor issues to be won. And the same thing is true for the civics. It might be about clothespins today, but to actually get all these changes, we need for real change, real political change. So in the case of the unions, you've got the 1973 strikes in the East, where you've got a huge number of people who come out. 1979. The state actually legalized unions, and you know, you had a 2-day stay away, for example, in the Transvaal, which involved up to 800,000 workers, and the students came in and got involved. 400,000 students took part too. So all this is leading in a direction, and you've got the advent of COSATU. Oh, I thought I had a picture of COSATU. Sorry. The Congress of South African Trade Unions, which is formed to aggregate these unions. 33 unions with 450,000 members at their inception come in, and then this grows to 1.3 million members by the end of apartheid. So what these organizations do, they ally with each other. They've already got a significant membership overlap, and they try to make the state ungovernable. Okay. And they allied together in the United Democratic Front, the UDF, the Mass Democratic Movement, the MDM. But again, the point was to make South Africa ungovernable. So they used boycotts, protests, strikes. And the state response was violence. Now, and I should mention that the ANC was also guilty of violence. So MK You also had vigilante justice, this horrible process of taking justice into their own hands, where they would do these things called necklacing, where if you were accused of, for example, cooperating with the white regime in the township, you would have to sit in a. This is going to sound awful, but you sit in a rubber tire, right? And then they light it on fire. You're killed that way. But the most of the violence was coming, of course, from the state. So there was a cycle where you had a march, a protest. The police would shoot. They would kill people. Then you would have a funeral. The funeral would become a march. The police would come out. They'd shoot. Repeat. Vicious cycle. We've seen this before. Where have we seen this? Iran, right before the revolution. So remember, we're just doing a small handful of cases. These are patterns, so they might sound like coincidences, but you see that these links can actually, a lot of the links that we're coming up with in this class can be linked to much larger phenomena. So finally, you do have this democratic transition because it's prompted by this inability to govern, and as well as foreign pressure. And so you've got economic decline in South Africa, these costly facade homelands, the failure of various half-hearted reforms, the end of the Cold War. Basically what happens in South Africa is neither side can win. And so the state opens up negotiations. At first they're secret with Nelson Mandela, who's the head of the ANC. He's actually in Robben Island, which is a prison, like Alcatraz, sort of an island prison. And eventually you have elections for a government of national unity, which reserves special seats for the old, and then the evolution of a full-on constitution, which leads to full freedom in South Africa. In 1994 are the elections, and then 1996 you have the new constitution passed. So we'll take a separate set of slides to go into the institutions.